From isolation to engagement, Barack Obama makes history by visiting Cuba. But can the former Cold War enemies trust each other now? And who stands to gain from the new chapter in their troubled relationship? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Folly Thibault. A U.S. presidential visit to Cuba was unthinkable just 15 months ago. It's been almost 100 years since the last visit by President Calvin Coolidge, and a U.S. embargo has crippled Cuba for more than 50 years. But when he announced a thaw in their frozen relations at the end of 2014, President Obama began a process of engagement he hopes will outlive his time in the White House. And his historic visit to Havana is being seen as a way of cementing his diplomatic legacy. Lots for us to discuss, but first, Al Jazeera's Patty Colhane sets up things from the Cuban capital, Havana.
After decades of silence between Cuba and the United States, this. A moment most Americans and Cubans never thought they would see after more than half a century of animosity, the U.S. president on Cuban soil being celebrated. But a closer look shows there are still deep differences. The man escorting President Barack Obama helped stop the U.S.-sponsored Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, which was a huge embarrassment for America. The president sent his own message in this guest book paying tribute to a 19th century revolutionary hero, writing his passion for liberty, freedom, and self-determination lives on in the Cuban people today. And as the leaders made statements, the differences came into sharp focus. Asked about political prisoners, President Raul Castro issued a challenge.
Dame la lista ahora mismo de los presos políticos para soltarlos.
You talked about political prisoners. Give me a list of these political prisoners, and I will release them immediately. What political prisoners? Give me names. If we have them, they will be released before the night ends.
He went on to criticize the human rights record of the U.S., saying Cuba offers universal health care and free education, pointing out areas he says the U.S. falls short, calling it a two-faced approach to human rights. President Obama went out of his way to show he didn't take offense.
But as you heard, President Castro has also addressed what he views as shortcomings in the United States around basic needs for people and poverty and inequality and race relations. And we welcome that constructive dialogue as well.
The president is going to continue the dialogue, but with opponents of the Castro government on Tuesday. A senior administration official tells me this is a highly unusual visit for them because, quite frankly, they're just not sure exactly what the Cuban government's going to do. One big question is, will they try to interfere with the president's meeting of those dissidents? The administration isn't sure. These were carefully choreographed, meant to send the message that the countries were moving on. But it also served to highlight that a half-century of distrust cannot be washed away with a few ceremonies, regardless of how historic they are. Patty Colhane, Al Jazeera, Havana, Cuba.
All right, let's get the thoughts of our guests now on today's Inside Story. In Washington, D.C., Kevin Casas-Zamora, director of the Inter-American Dialogue's Rule of Law program. Also in Washington, Rachel DeLevie-Orey, assistant director with the Atlantic Council's Latin America Center. Thank you for being on Inside Story. Kevin, if I can start with you. President Obama hailed a new day of openness between the U.S. and Cuba. But watching that press conference in Havana on Monday, there were some pretty awkward moments there, and it was clear that the old grievances and disputes were still there. So would you say that this visit really marks a historic turning point in this relationship?
It does. It does. I mean, the whole thing was very awkward for moments yesterday, but it is a sea change. The progress forward is not going to be smooth. It's gonna happen in fits and starts, and there's going to be pushback. And you get the sense that, you know, with some of the things that happened yesterday and in the previous days in Havana, you know, when activists were rounded up and arrested and so on, and beaten up, you get the sense that the Cuban government feels very threatened by this, and in some ways is overcompensating. By doing all these things. So you get the sense that this is going to be a complicated dance going forward, but I have no doubt that what we are seeing today and what we saw yesterday is a historic event of regional, with regional implications.
A historic event, you say, but you would agree nonetheless, Kevin, that the mistrust and anxiety remains on both sides, again, given from what we saw during that press conference in Havana?
Oh, no question, no question. I mean, it's impossible, to expect that to go away overnight. I mean, these are pretty hardened Cold War warriors, that you have on the Cuban side. I mean, they are not going to let that rest overnight. I mean, and in some ways, it's also part of their. I mean, they're driving a very hard bargain, and they're going to keep, bringing up all those grievances. Some of them legitimate, some of them less legitimate, but they're going to keep bringing them up.
Okay, let's get Rachel's thoughts on this. Rachel, there are many disagreements, of course, between Obama's policy and the Cuban policy, and a lot of the rhetoric that we've seen from Castro and Obama has been said before. Did you see or hear anything different during this historic visit?
Well, I think something that we heard from President Obama was a willingness to engage not just on issues that concerned Cuba, but on issues that concern the United States. He was very willing to talk about the situations of poverty in the criminal justice system in the United States, really welcoming a dialogue. And I think that that really demonstrates that, though absolutely, as Kevin said, you're not going to eradicate 5 decades of mistrust overnight, that there is now an openness between the two countries, and that hopefully means progress.
All right, so would you say then that Obama is doing all this not for Cuba's sake, but rather for the U.S.'s sake and its overall relationship with the rest of Latin America? What is the objective here as far as the U.S. is concerned, the ultimate goal, if you will?
I mean, I think that there are so many goals here that are really being achieved. One is getting rid of a policy that has at times really been damaging to the people of Cuba. Clearly, it hasn't gotten rid of a government that the United States does not support, but it has really put an economic strangle on the people of Cuba. So moving towards opening up a stronger Cuban economy that will benefit the people. It also gets rid of this relic of Cold War policy that our allies in Europe, our allies in Latin America, particularly in Mexico and Colombia, have said is really preventing us from advancing in a stronger partnership throughout the region.
Kevin, what do you see as the purpose ultimately of this détente? What is the objective long term? Is it to bring about change in Cuba, as some Cuban officials have suggested recently?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I have my doubts that that President Obama has in his mind, this idea that he's doing this in order to bring about change in Cuba, either immediately or in the long term. If that happens, that would be great, but it would be a byproduct of this decision. I think you phrased it very well. I mean, he's doing this, in my opinion, not for Cuba's sake, for the U.S. sake, because this had become a major foreign policy embarrassment for the U.S. I mean, when you go to the UN General Assembly year after year and you get clobbered, I mean, the last time support for the Cuban embargo was put to a vote, the result was 191-2. I mean, and that's unbecoming of a great nation such as the U.S.
Why did the U.S. keep going with this embargo? Sorry to interrupt you. Why did the U.S. keep going with this embargo, Kevin, even though the embargo failed to topple Castro?
Well, because there are there are all different kinds of domestic pressures. The fact that Florida happens to be a swing state in elections, the fact that the Cuban American community it's very influential in some quarters. I mean, you're seeing it. That 2 Cuban American politicians are running for president, or were running for president in this election cycle. I mean, there are all sorts of domestic pressures, but it's become. It became ostensible that the policy had failed. And as Rachel was saying, it had become a very significant obstacle in the way of building a stronger links with Latin America. Links which, by the way, when you take a glance at what's happening in other places, in Europe, in the Middle East, I think the U.S. would do very well to focus its attention, its steady attention, on building stronger links with Latin
Rachel,
America.
Kevin talked about the Cuban Americans. What is the sentiment among the Cuban exiles living in the U.S.? Is there a sense of betrayal today with this historic visit and the détente that seems to be happening?
You know, for so long, that was the conventional wisdom, that Cuban Americans, that Miami, that Florida wanted to maintain this policy, and because it was a swing state, it got to carry a lot of weight. But that's no longer the case. We've seen poll after poll show that people in Florida, people in Miami-Dade County, Cuban Americans, the majority are in favor of this policy. The majority are in favor of a rapprochement. The majority of them want to be able to get on Skype and talk to their cousins who are still in Havana.
But would they want to be part of this new Cuba? I mean, many of them left. Would they want to return today, you think? Would they want to be part of this so-called new Cuba?
You know, I think a lot of people have made a home here in the United States, and I think a lot of people might be interested in seeing how Cuba could develop. And so this is like any community that comes to the United States but still feels ties to their home country. I think that we will see a diverse reaction.
I want to talk about the issue of human rights, because that was one of the questions that was posed to President Castro, and of course it was a very awkward moment when he responded. There wasn't much talk about dissidents before, especially during the flag-raising ceremony at the U.S. Embassy in Havana. The dissidents weren't invited. It's tricky for the U.S. administration, isn't it, Kevin? I mean, how do you make human rights a key issue right now in this relationship without angering the Cubans?
Absolutely, but I think that President Obama made a point, and the U.S. government made a point, that if this visit was to happen at all, that had to be on the table. And President Obama has been very forthright about that. And as I said, I mean, there are issues in which they're not going to agree, and there's going to be a very significant pushback on the part of the Cubans. But I don't think the U.S. will let it drop, mostly for reasons of domestic policy. I think it would be awkward, to put it mildly, and probably worse, for President Obama just to go to Cuba and remain silent about issues that everybody knows that are very prominent in terms of the nature of the political regime in Cuba.
Right. Rachel, we talked about the Americans. I wonder, for the Cubans, what does normalization mean exactly? What are they expecting out of this relationship now?
Well, I think for the people of Cuba, this absolutely opens up further economic opportunities for them, expansion of the tourism industry, expansion of the banking industry, and that influx of capital is going to be really crucial for the expansion of the small private sector and for really being able to grow the Cuban economy. So I think that that's going to be the crucial first step that will really be beneficial to the people of Cuba.
But there will also be, now coming back to the human rights, there'll be more scrutiny now on Cuba and its human rights record. Do you think that the government will regret this reconciliation?
I think that the government had really no other option than to seek this reconciliation. This is a government that really suffered when it cut off relations, and when the United States cut off relations, really suffered with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And now their main benefactor, Venezuela, is struggling. They see the writing on the wall. And I think that the Cuban government had really no other choice, no other recourse, but to try and reestablish relations with the United States and have that be economically beneficial for a very difficult economic situation in the country right now.
Kevin, I think you want to jump in there.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most important things that we're seeing, with this visit is that, in a way, strangely enough, the human rights issue has become very prominent, but it has ceased to hold, to be able to choke the process of opening up relations between the U.S. and Cuba. I think President Obama made a very conscious decision to open up that relationship regardless of what the Cuban government does.
And some critics have said, Kevin, that the Castro government actually stepped up its crackdown of dissidents in recent months, you know, after this rapprochement was announced. Is that the case? Did you hear that? And if it is the case, why do you think that is? Why step up the crackdown on dissidents now?
I have the impression that they feel very threatened and they feel compelled to overcompensate to prove their revolutionary zeal. In a way, you know, to save face, strangely, you know, strange as it may seem. But the great thing is, I believe that President Obama is no longer decided not to be held hostage by the Cuban regime, which is exactly what had happened in previous attempts to open up the relationship. You know, the tit for tat kind of logic never worked. I mean, whenever you know conditions were laid upon the Cuban government would shut up, and you know, and the process would not go forward.
So, who do you think is in a stronger position then today, and who benefits the most from this rapprochement?
I think both do, but I have no doubt that in terms of cleaning up what had become an ostensible failure of U.S. foreign policy, the U.S. has a lot to gain from this, not to speak about economic opportunities and other aspects, you know, that may flow from this. You know, the notion that what Obama is doing is an award, you know, a benefit that he's a unilateral benefit that he's bestowing, you know, on the Cuban regime seems fanciful to me. I mean, Obama is doing this for the U.S. sake, and it's, I think, very wise.
Well, let's talk about the political implications, and I want to start with Cuba, Rachel. For Raul Castro, I think you would agree that this is a culmination of his own legacy, and it's far from what many people thought. I mean, he did not govern under the shadows of his brother, Fidel Castro. Do you see this being as perhaps the strongest point in his legacy?
Oh, absolutely. I think that we have seen there be tremendous support within Cuba for the opening of this relationship. And, you know, we thought that Raul Castro might be just a continuation of his brother, but they're clearly not ideologically identical. Raul Castro has overseen certain small but important economic reforms in the country, allowing for certain economic advancements, private sector growth. And so that's been part of really trying to open the economy a little bit more, really trying to salvage the economy of Cuba. And the rapprochement with the United States is a major piece of that. And I think that he will be remembered well for that by the people of Cuba.
Kevin, what about for President Obama? There's still a lot of opposition in the U.S. Congress, of course, to this rapprochement, this fierce opposition, in fact. What will happen, you think, after Obama leaves office and if the Republicans come to power? Do you think the normalization that we're seeing now is irreversible, or could things change and go back to where they were if a new administration comes in?
I very much doubted that it could go to the status quo ante. It could become, you know, a slower process, but I think, you know, all politicians across the spectrum in the U.S. know where the public opinion stands on this. And if anything, you know, one of the remarkable things of this process over the past year and a half has been that the reaction to this new approach on the part of the U.S. has been very muted. I mean, when you see an opinion poll saying that over 70% of U.S. public opinion is in favor of this, over 70% of U.S. public opinion is in favor of ending the embargo. When you see, and Rachel was alluding to this, that opinion polls are saying that even the Cuban-American community, even in the Cuban-American community, there's a strong majority in favor of what President Obama is doing. I mean, you see the writing in the wall.
Yeah, but do you think the Republican candidates to the presidency see that? Do they hear this?
They do. I mean, I mean, you know, there's a lot of theatrics going on, as you would expect in any electoral cycle. But ultimately, I think they would think very carefully. They would think twice before, going back to what had become, as I said, an embarrassment and a failure of U.S. foreign policy. And also, I'm pretty sure, I mean, there's a lot of economic pressure from different, or rather political pressure from different economic sectors in the U.S. pushing for a greater opening of the economic relationship with Cuba.
Okay, Rachel, your thoughts on what's going to happen next? Obama says he thinks the embargo will be lifted very soon. Is he right to be optimistic, in your opinion? And how do you see the relationship evolving under a new administration?
Well, I think Kevin is right that it will become politically not viable for the next president to roll back any of the changes that have been implemented. Even if it is legally possible, it's just not going to be worth the political capital. And so I think depending on who the next president is, he or she could advance this faster or slower. I'm not quite as optimistic as President Obama that this will make it through Congress, but I do think that both President Obama and whoever follows him could be more aggressive about opening up Cuba's access to the international financial institutions and really finding other ways to support the growth of the Cuban economy. And so when looking at the United States, I would say that this sort of remains in the executive office in terms of where the most opportunities for growth of this relationship are.
All right, Kevin, I think I'll give you the last word. If you want to say something to what Rachel just said, and also I want to ask you about the overall regional implications, of course. I mean, we're talking about US-Cuba, but what does it mean for the US's relationship with the rest of the region, with countries like Venezuela and Latin America in general?
Yeah, just a word about the embargo. I mean, there's this mistaken notion, in many quarters that the embargo is something that you can do away, at a stroke of a pen, either by the president or Congress. The reality is more complicated than that. I mean, the embargo is like a bomb that you have to dismantle bit by bit. And that's going to take a lot of effort and
but
a lot
has
of
the policy of the embargo changed anything?
Capital.
Sorry. Just for our viewers, has the policy of the embargo changed anything at all?
Certainly, the embargo has evolved, and the big sea change was in the 90s with the Helms-Burton Act that really set in stone and gave Congress, a greater say in the process of removing all the restrictions in the relationship with Cuba. So that that has changed quite considerably. So I mean, dismantling the embargo is a politically and legally more costly and complicated process than a lot of people think. As for the regional implications, I think they are very, very considerable. I was, until not long ago, at the OAS, at the Organization of American States, and I remember, whenever there was a General Assembly of the OAS, I particularly remember before the last Summit of the Americas in Panama, when the issue was brought to discussion about whether to invite Cuba to the Summit of the Americas, country after country in the hemisphere, even countries that have the closest, coziest of relationships with the U.S., Colombia, my own country, Costa Rica, country after country said loud and clear that they would not countenance the possibility of Cuba not being invited to the Summit of the Americas. So this had become a very significant irritant in the relationship of the U.S. with Latin America, and I think there's a regional analysis that underpins Obama's decision to go to Cuba, and I think it's a correct analysis.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you for a very interesting discussion, Kevin Casas-Zamora and Rachel DeLevie-Orey. Thank you both for joining us on Inside Story. And thank you as well for watching. You can always watch the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And of course, you can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is at AJ Inside Story. From me, Folly, Thibault, and the whole team, thanks for watching. Bye for now.